Hey everyone, this is the second video on intelligence, which is focused entirely on, or mostly on, how we test and measure intelligence from a psychological standpoint. Um, we'll also get into, so basically we're going to focus on kind of three things: the types of tests, or the history of the tests, the standards that are used on those tests, the variables that are used for the test, and then also the last thing we'll talk about is kind of some extremes and of intelligence, one way or the other, like extreme abilities and disabilities. So that's the kind of three big topics. Go ahead and jump right in. So um, when you talk about intelligence tests and testing, there's really two types of tests that are used. Some tests that are used to measure intelligence kind of combine these. We'll get in a little bit into that in a minute, but really the two main types of tests are achievement and aptitude tests. Achievement tests are testing what you've already learned. So this would be like any type of test we take in class, any exam. The AP psychology exam is more of an achievement test than an aptitude test, but um, it can kind of be considered both because it does kind of predict your ability for college level courses. Um, but driver's license, when you go get your driver's license, those kind of things, those are achievement tests. They measure what you've already learned. And then aptitude tests are tests that they the way that they are constructed is designed to try to predict your ability to either learn new skills or apply skills in a specific setting. Um, so the SAT and the ACT are used to predict your ability to learn skills like in college, which is why they're used as entrance exams and those kind of things. The GRE is the same thing as the SAT and the ACT, except for grad school. You usually take the GRE when you're trying to apply to grad school. Um, Also, there's other tests like the LSAT, which is what my wife had to take when she was applying for law schools. The MCAT is for med school. There's a bunch of different other ones. So those are predictive tests, aptitude tests for either just general skills like the SAT, the ACT, GRE, or for specific arenas like law, med school, whatever. Those are also aptitude tests as well. So most intelligence tests, like that we're going to talk about here in the next couple slides, are kind of a combo of these. They do test what you should know and have learned to that point when you take it, but they also are used to help predict your ability in the future as well, and for new skills that you may not know yet. Um, so just a quick little history. I don't want to spend a ton of time on these next couple slides, but this is kind of the development of the tests over throughout history. So Alfred Binet, this guy here, he was a French psychologist who, whenever he was in kind of the prime of his career, France, where he lived, decided to consolidate all of their schools into kind of a single unified school system. So they wanted a test to be able to um, kind of put kids in the classes that they needed to be in based on their abilities. And um, so he designed a test that focused mostly on mental abilities, patterns, memories, or memory, the ability to distinguish patterns, similarities, differences, those kind of things. And then as he was testing and gathering data, he began to notice that some of these younger kids, by like in their who were 6, 7 years old or whatever, 6, 7, 8 years old, were performing at the same level or even higher than older kids, 9, 10, 11 year olds. So what he decided as he started to gather more and more data, that he believed you could distinguish between a child's kind of biological age and then their mental age, is what he called it. So he believed that a child could have a higher mental age than their biological age if they were showing skills that were advanced for that age range. Um, so he was the first to really distinguish between the two. So what he did is he started to gather both, or he started to get to assign a mental score to the child and then compare it to, or a mental age to the child and then compare it to their biological or chronological age. So the mental age was like the level that they were doing skills on the average age range for that level. So, for example, if an 8-year-old was, or if an 8-year-old had a 10-year-old mental age, then that means that they were performing on what the average 10-year-old would know at 8 years old. That's basically what that means. So anyway, Benet, he used his test. He designed the test for schools, but he was afraid that it would be used as like a labeling device. So he didn't want it to be widespread. He didn't want it to be used just strictly for intelligence gathering, but it kind of was over time. So, but anyway, he was kind of the first to come up with the test that looked at intelligence on a wide scale. And then this guy here, Lewis Terman is his name. He was kind of a terrible person. We'll get more into that later, but he took Benet's test and then kind of revised it a little bit and renamed it the Stanford Binet intelligence scale. And he was the first to actually calculate out an IQ score. He was the first to use the term IQ. IQ stands for intelligence quotient. If you ever wondered what IQ stands for. And the reason is because it does use division, quotient for division. And what he does is he took the mental age that someone would score on this test, that divided it by their chronological age, and then multiplied it by 100. So that is why the average IQ score is 100. Because if you're 10 years old and you have a 10-year-old mental age, you divide 10 by 10, that's 1 times 100. 100. That's average score. Okay. But as you can see in the example there, if you're an 8-year-old, but you have a 10-year-old mental age, then 10 divided by 8 is 1.25, and you multiply that by 100, it's 125. So the 125 is an above average IQ score. Actually, well above average, but still. So that's the formula. By the way, I won't draw on the slide or anything, but that formula right there, mental age divided by chronological age multiplied by 100. You just kind of need to know that because every so often they'll throw on a test question. I mean, probably not this year because there's no in multiple choice this year, but it's still something, it's still something you need to know for the course moving forward. But yeah, that's and the reason I mentioned that Terman was a terrible person, and I'll kind of get into this a little bit towards the end, but he advocated for something called eugenics for most of his life. If you do not know what eugenics is, that's kind of, for lack of a better term, it's kind of controlled reproduction. And he believed that individuals who were highly intelligent should only be able or should only reproduce with other highly intelligent people, and therefore we would have a higher, more intelligent society. So yeah, he kind of advocated for people who had below average intelligence to not be able to reproduce, and that's terrible. So he did, by the end of his life, did kind of back off that stance, but for most of it, he was kind of a fill in the blank with your insulting term for him there. But anyway, and then the last guy and the last type of test, which is still used today, is the Wechsler test. David Wechsler here, he kind of looks like a mall magician, but he believed that intelligence wasn't one single thing. He believed in a number of different mental abilities make up intelligence. So his test involves a lot of different things. It involves visual questions. It involves just standard like intelligence testing, memory, patterns, similarities, differences. It took a lot of the same things from Binet, from Binet and Terman's tests and kind of updated them a little bit, but then also he added a couple of other things that were a little bit different. Now he used standard deviation to determine the IQ score, which Terman had not really done, but you don't really need to know most about that. Just know that that's one standard deviation from an IQ scale is 15 points. So each time you go up 15 points or down 15 points, you have gone one standard deviation away from the average, which is 100. So 115, 115 would be one standard deviation, 132, and then 145 would be 3, which most people don't get that high. But he started with just adults, and then eventually he expanded his test to also include preschool and school age children. Excuse me, gosh, preschool and school age children as well. So his is the most recent. He passed away in 1981, but a lot of his tests are still used today, because I know that because every so often I'll have a student in class say, "Oh yeah, I took an IQ test for this reason or whatever," and I remember those little red dice looking things from when I took it. So the Wechsler test is still used pretty common. It's a pretty common assessment today for intelligence tests. Okay, so some of the principles of how they construct these tests and make them. Some of these you probably have heard, or at least know what all these are. You may not have necessarily heard them in that name, but standardization or standardized test, that just means that the test is given in the same form and fashion to a large representative group, and then that group's data is used to create the standards and norms that will be used in the future. So when you take the AP test, even though it's going to be a modified AP test here in May, it is still going to be considered a standardized test because everybody is going to have the same. It's going to be administered the same way. So, as they say, obviously, in a normal year, it would be much more standardized. Everybody would have the same test environment, same amount of time, same questions, or at least same types of questions. And then you would get a score based on how you did as compared to the rest of the population that took it. Usually, some tests give percentile numbers. If you don't know what percentile numbers are, let's say you get your test score back and it says you're in the 85th percentile. The 80, if that means you did as well or better than 85% of the people who took it. So that's good. The higher the percentile, the better you did. So that's standardization. If something's standardized, it's uniformly presented the same way to everyone who takes it. Okay. Now, reliability. Obviously, if something's reliable, that means it tests. It produces consistent results. So what this means is that if you take the test multiple times, you should have consistent results. Now, do not hear that and say and think that you have to score the exact same every single time you take it or it's unreliable. That's not what it means. If you take a test and let's say you score an 88 the first time and then a 91 the second time, that's pretty consistent. But on the flip side, if you take it the first time and you make a 90 and then you make it a 64 on the second time, that's a little weird. It should be about the same if it's a reliable test. If it's a pretty reliable test, you should score about the same or consistently if you take it again or on future occasions. I remember when I was in high school, I took the SAT a couple of times to try to bump my score up a little bit, and each time I did a little better each time. But I think that was mostly because I was used to how the test was given. I don't think it was necessarily because I was doing better on the test. I scored very similarly. I think I took it 3 times, and I was within, I think, maybe 30 points in each, 30 or 40 points in each section every time I took it. So it was I was about the same. So it was a pretty reliable test in my opinion. Now, ways they measure this is through test retest, which is exactly what it sounds like. You take it once, you take it again. If it's about the same, pretty good. Split half is when they actually split the test in half, and it's from odd and even numbers, and the odd and even numbers should have about the same score. I don't really believe in that one as much as the test retest method, but both of them can be determined or can be used to determine reliability. All right, validity is measuring what it's designed to measure. So basically, if you take the test and it gives you questions on what it is supposed to be testing you on, it is valid. If it measures your ability to do the thing it says it does, it is valid. If you take, if you were to take if we were still in class and everything was still normal, and I, walked in and you were expecting a test on intelligence and memory, and I gave you a sociology test, that's not a valid test. That's not on memory. That's not testing what it's designed. Like I'm not testing you on what the test should be designed on. So validity again is it's the ability to measure what it's designed to measure. Sometimes criteria on validity is the same. You hear this thrown around as well. That is basically it's when test scores can be used to predict another measure. AP test scores are this way. AP test scores are, yes, they measure your ability in a certain area or what you've learned in a certain subject area, but it also is used to predict your ability and your ability to do well in future college classes, which is why you can get college credit out of the way if you do well enough. So that's why an AP test can be used to get rid of some college credits, because it shows your ability to do well in that arena. Okay, so last couple things, and then we're done. There are some extremes of intelligence. I mentioned this. I mentioned an example of this a little bit in the first video with when we talked about savants. Savants are weird because not. Sorry, that sounded bad. It's an interest. It's kind of a weird scenario in the sense that they have extreme abilities in some areas, but extreme disabilities most other areas. And savant syndrome is considered a disability, or an intellectual disability, even though there are some high functioning areas present in some cases. But intellectual disabilities are when you have a deficit of intellectual and adaptive functioning. Um, this can be just a biological reason. This can just be a brain functioning issue. It can be a genetic issue. An example of that is Down syndrome. It's a genetic abnormality that causes intellectual disability. And then sometimes birth defects, fetal alcohol syndrome has resulted in intellectual disabilities in the past. So this is just anytime someone has a deficit in intellect and adaptive functioning. And if you were to give, basically, if you were to give this someone who has an intellectual disability an IQ test, they would probably score pretty low, because of their deficit of intellectual ability. So there's that. And then the intellectual giftedness. This is the other end of the spectrum. This is when you have significantly above average scores in intellectual abilities. This doesn't guarantee anything per se. You know, and this isn't the same thing as being labeled academically, gifted. I mean, obviously they usually correlate, but they're not the same definition. But just because if someone's intellectually gifted doesn't mean that they are immediately destined for success. And the reason that Lewis Terman, the same guy I talked about, that was kind of a jerk for his beliefs and things like eugenics, but he did a study over time of people that he labeled as intellectually gifted, and then what he followed them throughout the years in kind of a long-term case study, longitudinal study. He found that these individuals who had been deemed intellectually gifted at a very young age, what he found was that they didn't always grow into, I guess, what you would expect. They didn't all become lawyers or doctors or anything like that. In fact, some of them didn't even become, didn't even become what you would consider a high, a good job. I mean, it was so. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're intellectually gifted, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be successful in careers or in your relationships. It just means that you would score pretty high on an IQ score, or an IQ test, and that you would be classified as intellectually gifted. And then this is kind of the nature nurture slide. How much of it is inherited, how much of it is environment. Um, Twin studies have been used on this, and there's evidence for both sides. Just to kind of spoiler alert, there's evidence for both sides. There's most of the time we use, or as with a lot of psychological studies, when you're looking at nature nurture, you look at the identical twin studies where it's twins that may have been separated at birth through adoption or something like that. They studied, and what they found was that um, there's evidence for both. On the top there, it says, some twins that were separated, they correlated more with the biological mother's IQ than their adoptive mother's. And then on the flip side of that, there's also studies of identical twins that, when they're raised separately versus raised together, twins that were given early childhood learning seem to have higher IQs than those that didn't, and things like that. So there's evidence for both.